Welcome to our read aloud of the split history of westward expansion. This book is interesting because it gives details about the topic of westward expansion from two different perspectives, the European settlers and the Native American tribes that were already inhabiting the western lands. As we read aloud, watch as I use our reading strategies to identify multiple main ideas. We will start with the settlers' perspective, Chapter 1, The Beginning. In April 1853, the Knight family, Joel, Amelia, and their 7 children, left Monroe County, Iowa, in a covered wagon. Their plan was to travel west to Oregon Territory. During the next 5 months, they endured sickness, storms, and the loss of many of their livestock. They reached Oregon in mid-September, where Amelia Knight gave birth in the covered wagon to her 8th child. A few days later, the Knight family crossed the Columbia River into Washington Territory, where they traded 2 yoke of oxen for a piece of land and a small log cabin. The Knight family wasn't unique. In the 1800s, thousands of Americans traveled from their homes in the East and Midwest to new lives in the West, a time known as westward expansion. So if I stop to pause about my readings thus far, one main idea that the author is telling me is that the settlers faced hardships along their way. My evidence for that is in this text feature right here, which is an illustration. I see a covered Conestoga wagon, and in that wagon I see a crowded family. I see 2 oxen struggling to pull that heavy wagon up rocky and hilly terrain. It looks very dark, like it might rain and have a thunderous storm. So my evidence for that is in that illustration. It might not have been a very easy trip to travel west. I could also see in the text that it says they endured sickness, storms, and the loss of many of their livestock. Let's continue. In the years since 1492, when Christopher Columbus made his first journey to the New World, England, France, and Spain and the Netherlands had all claimed land on the continent and tried to start colonies. In April 1607, the Virginia Company of London, England, established the first permanent English settlement in North America, Jamestown Colony. Jamestown was located about 60 miles, or 97 kilometers, from the Chesapeake Bay in what is now Virginia. In America, the European settlers would be able to own land, a goal most knew they'd never be able to achieve in Europe. But the settlers who made the difficult journey across the ocean faced hard times in their new country, including starvation, American Indian attacks, and disease. Of the 104 settlers who arrived in Jamestown in spring 1607, fewer than 40 were alive by the winter of 1608. But the colonists persevered, and more settlers arrived, including those who established Plymouth Colony in what is now Massachusetts in 1620. The settlers built towns and villages along the east coast of North America, next to the Atlantic Ocean, an important passageway for ships and also a place where the settlers could harvest seafood to supplement their diet. Virginia became a British royal colony in 1624, and by 1670, Britain had 12 colonies in what is now the eastern United States. Georgia, the 13th original colony, was established in 1733. So as I pause to think about my reading, another main idea is popping out. That settlers were moving in search of better lives. So my evidence for that is in the text, where it says the European settlers would be able to own land in America, a goal most knew they'd never be able to achieve in Europe. Also, here it says they built towns and villages along the East Coast. These towns and villages meant that they owned their own home and they owned their own business, which meant they could make a profit or money, certainly bettering their lives from that in England. I also see more evidence to support my other main idea from before, facing hardships along the way, because in the text it states they faced hard times in their new country, including starvation, American Indian attacks, and disease. Let's continue. By the 1700s, the American colonies included 3 separate regions: New England, the Middle Atlantic colonies, and the South. But although the regions were distinct from one another, they united to fight the British for their independence in the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. The colonies won their freedom from British rule and were now the United States of America. As the population of the eastern United States grew, the government wanted people to settle the West. Congress assisted this goal by enacting the Land Ordinance of 1785. This law created a uniform system in which land was divided into ships of 36 square miles. Each township was divided into 36 sections, which were made up of 640 acres. In 1787, Congress enacted the Northwest Ordinance. This act established government and laws in an area north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River. Now the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The U.S. government sold land to anyone who could afford it, raising money for the government and helping settlers move west at the same time. Many people took them up on the offer, which began a large westward migration. So as I pause to think again, I still see evidence to support both of my main ideas from before. One main idea, the settlers were in search of better lives, continues to be seen in evidence in the text. They fought a war to break away from a country that didn't allow them to own their own land. And the United States government bought land for settlers to purchase. So now they were able to own their own land, build their own home, and have their own business. Definitely on a path to having a better life than before. I also see evidence to support my second main idea, which was they faced hardships along the way. Well, one of a hardship might be fighting in the Revolutionary War to gain their freedom. Moving on, the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, the United States increased in size considerably. That was the year the United States bought 828,000 square miles of land from France. The land cost $15 million and covered a huge section west of the Mississippi River. After the Louisiana Purchase, the size of the United States doubled. President Thomas Jefferson hired Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the newly acquired lands. He was especially interested in having Lewis and Clark look for a river that extended west from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. A river route would make it easier to move goods from the east to the west. The explorers left on their journey from St. Louis, Missouri in 1804. The Lewis and Clark expedition lasted 2 years. When the explorers returned in 1806, they told Jefferson that while they didn't find a river that ran all the way to the ocean, they did discover a land filled with animals that could be trapped, thick forests, huge mountain ranges, and thousands of acres of land, plus a number of American Indian groups who were living there. Over the next several years, settlers flocked to the area. By 1840, the states of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri had been formed from some of the land in the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so stopping to pause now from my reading, I'm still finding evidence to support my main idea of the settlers moved in search of a better life. The land that the government purchased was filled with animals that could be trapped. These animals were then sold for their furs, and their furs allowed the settlers to make a profit. The thousands of acres meant that that land can be farmed. Again, crops bring in profits for the settlers who farm them. Manifest destiny. In the 1840s, a belief called manifest destiny began to gain popularity among Americans. It was the belief that God wanted Americans to live across the entire continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Newspaper editor John O'Sullivan coined the term in 1845. He wrote that it was the United States' manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us. O'Sullivan summed up what many Americans had believed for a long time, that they had the right to live wherever they wanted, and that it was their destiny to take any land they wanted. They believed that was what God wanted them to do. These Americans didn't think that they were taking land from the American Indians. Instead, they would be settling the land and improving it for both themselves and for future generations. They would also be spreading Christianity at the same time. As I stop to pause here, I see that the author is trying to tell me a third main idea for this chapter 1 of the split history of westward expansion. I think the author is trying to tell me that the settlers were inconsiderate and took something that wasn't theirs. They had no right to this land because it belonged to somebody else. In 1845, the United States tested the theory of manifest destiny by annexing the Republic of Texas. It had been part of Mexico until declaring independence in 1836. The United States went to war with Mexico over disputes about Texas's borders. The United States won the 2-year Mexican War in 1848. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico gave what is now the states of California, New Mexico, and Arizona to the United States in return for $15 million. The land that opened up to settlers during the westward expansion was huge. It extended from the Appalachian Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. It spread from the Mexican border in the south to the Canadian border in the north. For the settlers who were moving from eastern cities, the frontier sounded like a dream that was about to come true. So here I am at the end of chapter 1 of the split history of westward expansion. And let me just think about my 3 main ideas the author was telling me as I read through chapter 1. I have evidence to support that the settlers were moving to the new continent and to the western part of the United States in search of better lives. I have evidence to support that while the settlers were moving to the new continent and the western part of the United States, they faced many hardships along the way. And I have some evidence to show that the American settlers, in their search of a better life, also were inconsiderate and took land away from people who were already living there. So I want you to try this strategy when you're reading your articles and your books and watching your videos on westward expansion. Pause for a moment and think about what you read and what main idea the author might be trying to tell you.